when I was watching Steven Universe as it was airing, there was hardly anything as exciting as seeing that a Sephonie episode was coming up. And with a title as cool as Jungle Moon and a synopsis as vague as Sephonie finds themselves alone on an adventure, I was pretty stoked for January 5th, 2018. And after the cliffhanger ending of Lars of the Stars with the fusion hurtling into space, I knew we were in for a great episode. But I never would have expected what we got, which was ultimately one of the best outings in the entire series, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. In this video, we're going to dive into the terrific Jungle Moon and talk about how it uses its atmospheric first half and its dream-centric second half to illustrate the parallels between Pink Diamond and her son, and weave together a beautiful episode about feeling ignored.
What is wrong with you, ship? Oh, pretty much everything.
The episode starts right after the fusion ship was hit at the end of Lars of the Stars, as Sephonie crashes into the beautiful scenery that awaits them at the surface of the titular Jungle Moon. And yeah, it sure is beautiful, as the colors feel like nothing else the show has ever put on screen, giving the whole first half of the episode a really alien feel. Get it? Alien? Anyway, we'll get to those in a second, but first we gotta spend a little bit of time talking about this shot from the beginning of the episode, as Sephonie stares in awe at the remnants of the planet in the sky. This shot ends up being more prevalent with the knowledge of this episode's ending, but to talk about it a little bit now, it immediately presents such a contrast between the lush vegetation and the colorful atmosphere of the Jungle Moon, and the barren, destroyed reality of the planet that it's orbiting. Anyway, we're gonna be talking about that for way too long later, so let's go ahead and move to Sephonie discovering the cockpit, which begins something else really interesting this episode does, which is the back and forth nature of which first person pronoun that Sephonie uses as they switch between I and we to describe when they feel more stable and more frazzled respectively. It's a bit confusing to keep track at first, as it's kind of backwards initially, but it eventually makes for a really interesting way to keep track of which statements come from either Steven or Connie as they come as a we, or a unified front as Sephonie as they come after I. Speaking of which, while this certainly isn't a new thing for Sephonie, and not even the first time I've talked about it on this channel, the way that AJ Michalka switches between all three inflections as Steven, Connie, and Sephonie is just ultra impressive, and they do something else really interesting with this idea later in the dream sequence. But to not get ahead of myself, let's get back to this episode and finally to the aliens, as this episode introduces non-Earth, non-Gem life forms. Obviously, the idea of foreign life forms in the Steven Universe isn't exactly one that's ever really dismissed, but I love how they initially portray this encounter as terrifying before it's revealed to be quite manageable.
Glad they're okay.
This initial interaction with the alien ultimately becomes representative of Sephonie's time on the Jungle Moon, as the scary and mysterious landscape becomes filled with deer-like creatures and harmless vegetation as Sephonie ventures deeper into it. The montage that showcases this is really fantastic too, as it does something that Steven Universe is generally pretty averse to and has the characters stop talking for a second. Seriously though, having a nice Samurai Jack-esque montage with the art style of the show and the serene beauty of Jungle Moon was almost a necessity, and the episode pulls it off really well, giving us a really nice adventuring vibe that the show hasn't had in a couple of seasons at this point. Sephonie is a great protagonist in this respect, as it becomes relatively easy to forget that they are two kids fused together and to just see them as a young adult scavenging, which gives off a feeling that really isn't felt anywhere else in the series, as the show rarely focuses on just one character. In general, while a lot of discussion surrounding this episode ultimately forms around the dream sequence in the second half, and yeah, most of this video is going to be about that too, I think it's worth noting that not only is its first half really beautiful and funny and has some terrific music to back the whole sequence up, it's also got a little thematic nugget in the form of Sephonie realizing that they can thrive in a world that was once completely alien to them. While the way that Sephonie got to this new place was bumpy and less than ideal, they were eventually able to take control and really begin to thrive. I'll touch on this a bit more at the end of the video, but I've been dying to talk about the dream sequence, which comes after Sephonie is chased into a building that Steven says is familiar, as the fusion is forced to camp there for the night.
Good night, Sephonie. Good night, Sephonie. Sweet dreams.
The dream opens up with Stefanie and Connie's house as the show continues their dream tendencies to operate on the logic that you kinda just accept everything that happens when you're asleep, as Stefanie never once questions why they're so tiny compared to the rest of their room, as the episode starts off with the biggest and easiest to spot piece of symbolism in the episode, as Stefanie is portrayed as small to illustrate that, surprise, the character feels small or insignificant. I love the way that Connie's mom both rises in the scene to reveal her size relative to Stefanie, and the way that her dialogue is written, slowly revealing that the lines coming out of her don't really make sense for Dr. Maheshwaran, with her command to wipe out all organic life on the planet, not only confirming her identity as some sort of gem leader, but also diminishing the slim hope that the diamonds hadn't been wiping out life to colonize planets, as well as the slightly less slim hope that they weren't aware they were doing so. Watching Stefanie traverse across her living room is great, and definitely gives Chibi Robo vibes, but back to the episode. The reveal with Dr. Maheshwaran having the yellow diamond eyes being accompanied by the diamond synth is a really sick moment, and the transition from Connie's house to the moon base is really smooth. Speaking of really smooth, Stefani's voice transitions along with everything else in this moment to an inflection that doesn't really resemble Stefanie, Steven, or Connie, a voice that sounded completely alien when I first watched this episode, but it does arguably sound a little bit like a younger Rose Quartz in hindsight. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, as it's important to note at this point that while we're still following what looks like Stefanie, it's pretty clear that this has just become a flashback of sorts, with the character swaps meant to highlight some parallels that we'll get to at the end of the video. Knowing that this is the case, and knowing pretty quickly that this is a conversation between Pink and Yellow, you can begin to see this segment as a first look at Pink Diamond's character, which pretty quickly reveals herself as the little sister of the other diamonds, if you will, as she essentially has a temper tantrum when she's told that she can't have her own colony. This scene feels so cinematic with the music touches, and the snap from Yellow Diamond as she tells Pink to act like the diamond that she is genuinely jolting. And the cut with Stefanie or Pink Diamond walking away clearly hurt and embarrassed is such a humanizing moment for the character that has seemed so distant ever since her name was first mumbled, and the way that she finishes the dream by slamming her fist into the glass is one of the most memorable shots in the entire show, as it's the first time that we see a glimpse of the elusive Pink Diamond, as well as just showing the immense power that Pink has despite being the quote-unquote weak diamond. This shot doesn't seem that important with the knowledge of Rose Quartz's identity that would come later in the season, but when you remember that at this point the only thing that we know about Pink is that Steven's mom shattered her, it's a pretty big deal to just see her act like a little kid. The entire dream sequence is just out of this world and how impressive it is, and I'm going to talk more about the symbolic nature of it in a second, but first we gotta wrap up the episode. After the dream sequence wraps up, Stefanie makes their way up to the top part of the moon base, where the episode confirms that the events in their dream were accurate, and that they occurred on the jungle moon. I really like that the episode chooses to keep Stefanie together at this moment, even when they very clearly just become Steven and Connie talking to each other, as it shows just how much their relationship has grown since their fusion formed 4 seasons ago. The use of Yellow Diamond's console to contact the ship is a fairly creative way to wrap up the episode, and the faux action shot that ends the episode is hilariously anticlimactic, as it almost feels like the episode shrugging its shoulders at your expectation that there will be another great moment after the bombshell that was the end of the dream sequence. The episode does manage to sneak in one final great shot though, as the end of the episode places the camera behind the broken glass, as Steven begins to look at everything he thinks he knows about the gems through the events that he just witnessed. While it's easy to see Jungle Moon as a tale of two halves, and in some regards it definitely is, I still think that it's important to point out that the dream is somewhat connected to the atmospheric first half through the fact that they both explore the theme of isolation, albeit from completely different angles. While exploring the moon, Stefanie feels isolated in the sense that they are the only intelligent life on the landmass, and thus, despite being a fusion, they feel alone, albeit together. Oh, sorry, wrong episode. episode, but in contrast, the dream looks at Pink's isolation in the sense that they are ignored by the intelligent life around them and treated like a little kid, and that they are the only member of their 4-unit group to not be powerful, which sounds awfully familiar to a certain title character's Season 1 plight. Oh yeah, that's right, Pink Diamond acts remarkably similar to a younger Steven, and while the dream sequence begins in Connie's house, and while the beginning of the sequence does compare Connie's relationship with her mother to that of Pink and Yellow Diamond, the real comparison or parallel this episode wants to make is between Pink Diamond and Steven, as the episode continues to plant the seeds for the reveal in A Single Pale Rose, with Steven beginning to find himself relating to the gem that his mother is famous for killing a bit too much. It's a moment that feels immensely important in the series as the full turning point towards the 5th season idea that Rose Quartz might actually be a bad person, which is somewhat reversed by the end of the show, but still permeates into future, as the reveal that the diamond that Steven relates to wasn't killed by his mother that he has complicated feelings about, but was his mother that he has complicated feelings about, doesn't exactly soothe all of his angst. There is one more thing I want to touch on before wrapping up this video though, which is the shot of the planet that I talked about at the beginning of the episode being contrasted to that of the same planet at the end of the episode. While visually fairly similar shots, these moments could not contrast further tonally, as while Sephonie initially looks at the planet with awe at the visually striking image outside of their comprehension, the second look at the planet literally through the windows of the moon base is in horror, as they remember both the image of the vibrant planet seen in their dream, as well as the order from Yellow Diamond to wipe out any life that once called it home. With the knowledge that they gain in this episode, Sephonie is never again able to look at the planet without thinking of the lives lost and the beauty demolished, just as Steven becomes unable to think of his mother again without thinking of the gem that she shattered, a gem in which he sees himself as the 4th member who constantly looks up to the other 3 in their group, but never quite feels seen as an equal. In this episode, as Steven finds another planet that faced the same dilemma as Earth, but didn't have the help of the crystal gems, the big gem conflict that always felt disconnected from the rest of his life suddenly hits closer to home than ever. Anyway, that's gonna be about it for me. If you have an episode of Steven Universe or any other show you want to see me cover, let me know in the comments, and if you want to see what I'm working on next, or just see any animation opinions that don't make it into videos, you can find my Twitter somewhere down there too. Either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in about a week with another video on a different 2010s Cartoon Network show with a surprisingly active fan base. Thanks for watching.